So at last, it's the end of term in the House of Lords. Our recess started today, Thursday, 2 days after the House of Commons, and all I can say is phew, I'm glad that's over. To say that there's a bad atmosphere in Parliament is the understatement of the year, but I'll explain a little more. Just one thing to start is, it's really dawned on me in the last week, particularly, how large the gap is between the discussions that you have in the Palace of Westminster versus what's happening on the ground in the real world. And this was exemplified by a short question on the use of hotels by asylum seekers, people who come on the small boats, and all the controversy around it, obviously centering on Epping and now latterly Diss and other places as well. I wasn't intending to speak. It's only a 10-minute discussion, so there's not much time. I knew there'd be a lot of competition, but I could not believe that I sat through the whole of the 10 minutes and nobody, I mean nobody, mentioned the concerns of local people. Everything was centred on how horrendous it was that there was troublemakers turning up on demonstrations, how we all had to congratulate the police for keeping control of the situation, that they were the heroes of the hour, that we should be very careful about anything that would antagonise the police. Just no mention whatsoever about what the issue was. I don't even think we talked about the people staying in the hotels and what the controversy around migration was. And so right at the end I managed to just sneak in a question to that point, but I couldn't believe that they'd managed to ignore that issue. Anyway, you can see my question below, and I can safely say, if you look at the Minister's response, that I had upset the apple cart. You just weren't meant to have that point of view, to say that perhaps the misinformation, which they'd all talked about as being a real problem, meaning misinformation by the far right, that possibly it was misinformation to describe the local people who were furious and frustrated that they weren't being heard as far right racist thugs, and that might be something that the Minister would address. But anyway, another example of that was that there was a fantastically interesting debate about newspaper ownership, which again indicated how far removed things can go. But anyway, to explain it, we passed at the House of Lords last year an important motion suggesting that foreign states, not foreign owners, but foreign states could not own UK newspapers beyond having a small percentage of that ownership. And this was in relation to the undoubted Middle East interest in buying the Telegraph. That caused some concerns. Because if a foreign state owns a newspaper, that is quite a serious breach of potentially newspapers' editorial independence, and there was concern about press freedom. Regardless of what you think of that, that was a motion that was passed unanimously, all sides of the House, as they say. Labour was in opposition then, but we all agreed it. In the interim, there's a certain amount of pressure being put on the government, the new Labour government, to change that position, to water down the commitments. On the one hand, people have argued that possibly it means that some newspapers won't be able to get enough investment to carry on. There's undoubtedly Abu Dhabi influence coming to bear on this discussion. So behind the scenes, without ever coming back to Parliament, the Labour government had implemented a statutory instrument which is unaccountable to anyone in Parliament, that would change what Parliament had decided to do. And this is completely anti-democratic, and what's more is they tried to do it in secret. They said that they were responding to a consultation. They then wouldn't reveal the nature of that consultation. It was then FOI'd, Freedom of Information Act, Freedom of Information requests were sent, and found out in that consultation there were only 4 people who replied to the consultation, 4, and they weren't 4 people, they were 4 newspapers with particular interests. And those Freedom of Information requests indicated that some of the replies were heavily redacted. This is a serious assault on press freedom, and there was about 2 hours worth of discussion in the House of Lords yesterday during the week, because the Liberal Democrats and in fact some Conservatives were so concerned that they put forward both a regret and a fatal motion to the statutory instrument, which is the only way that you can actually get a statutory instrument debated at all, and a vote was called. There was fantastic speeches, again, not my area, wasn't going to speak. But I realised that after 2 hours, nobody, not one person, had mentioned a major assault on press freedom and the issue of secrecy, behind closed doors, keeping things hidden, the very themes of the debate. In other words, the scandal over the Afghan list, the fact that a super injunction had been used to deprive the UK press of investigating or even mentioning at any point the fact that there was this problem of the leaked Afghan list of Afghan either interpreters or people who'd helped the British Army, or people that just were on a list the British Army held. We all know that's a major scandal, but it's just disappeared from view, having embarrassed everybody for a few days. Cross-party consensus, don't mention the super injunction. And so even though it's supposedly in the public eye, it was quietly forgotten. So again, right at the end, I jumped up and mentioned the super injunction. I'm not saying this to talk about myself, but more because it's a worrying sign that even though there's some very fine parliamentarians in the House of Lords and some of the discussions are really interesting, a lot of the time, a lot of things are not discussed even when they should be. Actually, I was pleased that there was a debate on free speech last week. This was actually called by Lord Lebedev, he of owning the Evening Standard fame, who, because of his father being in the KGB, had been treated with somewhat kid gloves and was a very controversial peerage when he became a Lord about 5 years ago. But anyway, he organised a debate on free speech. You only get an hour in these balloted debates, so I was glad to participate in that, and you can see my contribution below. But it is refreshing, at least, that some people think that free speech is important, and it was actually nice to be in an atmosphere in which free speech was not tutted about in the way that it usually is on the main floor of the House. It was also refreshing that one of the people who spoke used it to talk about the super injunctions and the great threat to free speech when the state, the government, all parties at an executive level, not the parliamentary parties, actually use the law to cover up secrets. And I was glad that that got raised. Some of the things I want to talk about, another threat to free speech that I've been involved in and that people will have followed is what the Free Speech Union are calling the banter ban, clause 20 of the Employment Rights Bill. We are now on the final stage. We've just finished the Employment Rights Bill. It's just, as it were, finished its time at report stage in the House of Lords. And on the banter ban, there was a number of speeches, there was an argument about it, and you could see mine below. What was interesting in that was we lost that vote, and the reason we lost that vote was because the Liberal Democrats sided with the Labour Party in saying that this wasn't an issue, that the possibility of people's freedom to go to the pub, to go to the gym, go to a bookshop, talk freely, that it was quite feasible that that would be then used by employees of any establishment to take their employer to an industrial tribunal, and this was likely to have a chilling effect. It's been well researched, the speeches were very good. The Lib Dems just said, no, we're not interested. And I really did feel a sense of disappointment because the Liberal Democrats sometimes can be liberal and democratic. In this instance, they'd done a deal, effectively, it seemed to me, with the Labour government, and so consequently we lost that motion, which was disappointing. Again, you can see my speech below, and I do think that the harassment clauses in that clause 20 are going to cause serious problems for a lot of workplaces in the future who will be frightened to allow members of the public to speak freely and will spend their whole time watching what people say, implementing speech codes, all sorts of things like that. In relation to the General Employment Rights Bill, just to whiz through a few different things, I want to just establish something. The Employment Rights Bill is boasted about by Angela Rayner and her colleagues in the Labour government as a workers' rights bill. This is going to be the most substantial increase in workers' rights for many generations, they say. By the time I've finished going through it in detail, whilst about 20% of it I support, as I've said before, it really is increasingly obvious that this is a bill that's been put forward, put together by trade union bureaucrats. It's about protecting the trade unions. And it's worth noting that the trade unions only represent 20% of workers in this country. And that's not because the nasty employers stopping people joining trade unions, because the trade union movement has increasingly become distant from the interests of its membership. Nothing could have been clearer than in a debate about the right to be accompanied, when, to all of our horror to a certain extent, if you are involved in a grievance complaint at work, you can only take as a representative either a work colleague or a trade union representative. So if you're not in a union, or you don't want a trade union representative, or in the case of many, for example, women who work in the NHS, nurses, who might find that the trade union is on the side of HR and management when it comes to, for example, sex and gender, then you have to bring a friend. And if the atmosphere is such that you are being disciplined by your bosses for an opinion, then you're not going to be able to get one of your colleagues to join you, because they'll be frightened that they could be disciplined too. And so simply there was a motion for the right to be accompanied, where you could choose who you bring in. And the trade union movement absolutely refused to accept it. They refused to accept that anyone could represent workers apart from them, even though only 20% of the country are members of trade unions. Absolutely irrational, no justification whatsoever, very much a trade union closed shop. And it's so frustrating, because I've, over the decades, been very positive about trade union rights, expanding trade union membership, but the way they're going to actually alienate more people. In that sense as well, I think that it was telling that they made an absolute infernal fuss to ensure that the bill retained in it an opt-out of the political funds. That is where, if you are a member of a trade union, remember this is only 20% of all workers, that you automatically pay your money into a political fund, and that the executive of the trade union that you join will decide what kind of politics it's spent on. And I simply was suggesting, there was an amendment, seemed perfectly sensible, that we retain a compromise that was made in agreement with the trade unions and the Labour Party in the past, only in 2016, that you have to opt in, which at least puts the trade unions in a position where they have to convince their members why they should pay some of their union dues into the political fund. But nobody wanted that to happen, because, as they said, we lose money otherwise. So that again seemed to me to be a matter of the trade unions stomping their feet and saying, we want this to be the way we dictate it. And it's trade union leaders, trade union bureaucrats, not trade union members. And then finally, the whole of the employment rights bill ended very sourly. A lot of acrimony, a lot of rows occurring late last night into the very late, about going on for midnight, when there was an argument about the fact that the government has afforded itself a new power. They're giving the Secretary of State the power to be able to take an employer, a workplace, to an employment tribunal, even if an individual worker doesn't want them to. So they would say, for example, Claire, we know that you've had a bit of trouble at work, you don't want to take it any further, you're not interested in taking the lawfare result, but we don't care what you want, we're going to take it on your behalf. And the Law Society, lots of individuals in society, lots of campaigning groups are completely mystified by this incredibly important power being handed to the state to act on behalf of workers when they don't want, when they give no consent for lawfare to happen in their name. In the course of that discussion, in which there's various things that happened to me, like they cut me short, they refused to let me ask a question, even though they let loads of law lords ask loads of questions. I kind of like threw their weight around, it was all very unpleasant. But in the course of that, the Liberal Democrats again admitted that they'd been having discussions with the government, and that they'd found out, and they said, in our conversations we realise how important this is, because it will be used to protect vulnerable people, because vulnerable people won't be able to necessarily assert their right to want to go to an employment tribunal. Somebody has to act on their behalf, because they'll be intimidated, or maybe they don't speak English, or maybe they're new migrants, and in other words, it ended up being a piece of legislation, that being brought in for migrant workers, very unclear why this had come from. It basically insults any migrant worker by saying that they have no autonomy, that they're not capable of making a decision about whether they want to take something to an employment tribunal, but also, yet once more, weaponises the vulnerable to usurp workers' freedoms and give power to the state. And remember that even though they used examples of vulnerable migrant workers, people who are so exploited that they can't speak for themselves and so therefore the state must act on their behalf, that isn't written in the bill. The bill simply says that the Secretary of State has the power to do this and to run roughshod over any individual worker's agency or capacity to say no. It descended into an unpleasant exchange that just about summed up the way this whole parliamentary term has felt, which is that the Labour government are obviously very, very unpopular in the country. The Conservatives are in major decline, and no matter how many reshuffles Kemi has, nobody seems to be taking too much notice of them. The Liberal Democrats are cozying up to the Labour Party in some ways. I don't know whether they're planning some Lib-Labour pact for the future, but there's something going on there. But there's a general atmosphere in which, because there is very little power to be had outside of the chamber, they're exerting via bureaucratic methods, via the rule book, via even telling us that we've got to be careful of the way we explain things and the tone we use. They're exerting control and power by trying to control what happens in Parliament itself, which is very dangerous for democracy. Anyway, I can't tell you how delighted I am to escape the place for a few weeks. I'm going to spend, I'm having a week off, but which is very nice for me, first time for many years. But I'm then going to be back working with the Academy of Ideas team at ensuring that the Battle of Ideas Festival on the October the 18th and 19th is packed full of the kind of politics that we really need to discuss. No holds barred, free speech allowed. I hope that you're all going to be coming, and we will be advertising all the special offers below. I also spent some time, I will be spending no doubt some time doing media work. So this week I did Politics Live, in which we discussed the BMA strike, of course the war in Gaza, whether we should recognise the state of Palestine, pensions, which by the way I rambled on about, know absolutely nothing about, and I should have shut up, talked far too much. And also I made the point that rather than discussing the Tory reshuffle, we should be talking about some real issues, like the fact that there's a crisis around migration and nobody knowing how to solve it. At least we should be talking about that issue rather than rearranging the deck chairs. And then this evening, which is Thursday evening, I'm on Newsnight. God knows how that's going to go. Apparently we're going to be talking about the online safety bill, age verification, and what's happening to Donald Trump in America. So do take a look at the links below. But in general, I hope that you find some of these reports useful. I'm glad that Parliament's having a break, because I think everybody in the House of Lords, and there are some great parliamentarians amongst the peers, they're not all just sellouts by any stretch. There's fantastic speakers, some great minds, even though the majority of what goes on there, I have to say, makes me very worried about the state of politics and of democracy. But I do think we all need a break from it, and to recognise that the real world is not going on recess. Things are going to happen over the summer, and we'll ensure at the Academy of Ideas that we keep in touch, because we're not all going to be on holiday.